After a quiet few months on the Game of Thrones front, we get a ton of news in the last 48 hours, and it's been crazy. And apologies, I gotta start a video like this, but if you could please consider subscribing to the channel, and if you are a subscriber, if you could check and make sure you are still subscribed and have that bell hit, I would appreciate it. YouTube just did its annual bot cleaning, and sometimes there is collateral damage. And if you could like and share the videos as well, I would appreciate it. And guess what? Your favorite YouTuber would appreciate it. So, after HBO cancels the Blood Moon prequel, the only diverse female-led prequel, the one that I predicted the Mary Sue was writing an article about, well, here it is. They wrote the article. And I love this real-time response from HBO because they have announced a new prequel, that white male-led one that George R.R. Martin is directly involved in. But HBO still wants you to come and spend some of that cheddar after they completely destroyed the biggest show on television, the biggest show they will ever have, Game of Thrones. Do you want to know why that happened? Well, Dan and Dave were brutally honest and unintentionally honest at a Q&A about 3 days ago in Texas. I found an article that pretty much goes over the entire thing, and you're going to want to listen to this video because it's going to confirm all of your worst fears about Game of Thrones. It's going to confirm that Dan and Dave were Dumb and Dumber. But real quick, let's get to the announcement. This is all we have. This came out 27 minutes ago on Twitter from HBO. House of the Dragon, Fire Will Reign. This series is co-created by George R. Martin and Ryan Condell. Miguel Sapochnik, the one who said it didn't matter where Arya came from when she killed the Night King, will partner with Condell as showrunner and will direct the pilot and additional episodes. Yay! HBO will probably get a lot more cheddar from Normies, but book fans, are you really buying this? This is it for Wins a Winner, by the way, and I talk about that later in the video. Condell will be writing the series. That is great. Okay, a lot of this video I said was already recorded because it's based on an article that transcribed the Q&A from 3 days ago. Let's get to it.
Nerdrotic.com.
This one goes out to all of the Access Media members, hypocritics, and other YouTubers who called me and others out for criticizing Game of Thrones. The season was a total collapse, and it's now confirmed by the showrunners. Dan and Dave recently came out and confirmed they were in over their head. They didn't know what they were doing, and they were surprised they were given the series. Now, let's get to this article because it's jaw-dropping. I read this article on a live stream yesterday, and tonight I'm probably going to have to do it with a little less emotion because my kid is asleep. Link will be in the description. But this is vindication for every critic of Game of Thrones Season 8 and prior seasons. After this Q&A, the label of Dumb and Dumber is more applicable now than ever because they still think they made good seasons of television towards the end of Game of Thrones. In this Q&A, I think they were coming off like they were just a couple of lucky guys who learned on the job and made quality television. But subconsciously, they were honest, and we get confirmation that they didn't know what they were doing. Now, this author there's a lot of heavy editorializing in this, some of which I agree with. This is from Forbes. Game of Thrones showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss confirmed the worst suspicions of the fan base. And yes, we are going over this whole article because it is worth it. And Star Wars fans, I need you to listen because Disney Star Wars is heading down the same path. And this article is equal to Bob Iger's confessions of a few weeks ago. The ones where he betrayed George Lucas, except this one's worse. Dan and Dave betrayed the fandom. They betrayed HBO. They betrayed George R.R. Martin. And in a lot of ways, this is a betrayal of Hollywood because it shines a light on the nepotism, the cronyism, and the ineptitude of people who are in charge of billion-dollar franchises. Does this sound familiar, Disney Star Wars? After the disastrous final season of Game of Thrones, which left many fans furious at the flat conclusion to an epic story, writers/showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss have been extremely quiet, even going so far as to cancel their scheduled appearance at Comic-Con. We all knew why Dan and Dave backed out of Comic-Con mysteriously, but we get some confirmation later on in this article, but that was a punk move, leaving the actors to take all the heat, leaving the actors to suffer through that awkward panel. You could find it on YouTube. Check it out. It's pretty bad. At this point, every single scene, character arc, or a lack thereof, and poorly planned plot point has been thoroughly dissected and dismissed by disappointed fans, critics, and YouTubers. Hello. Blame fell squarely on the shoulders of Benioff and Weiss, with Game of Thrones fans recognizing that the sudden shift in quality was entirely due to decisions made in the writing room and were generally mature enough not to blame the actors or crew members, which we did not do. I consistently said they did a great job. They did the best they could with what they were given. Benioff and Weiss are due to tackle Star Wars next, so we should wish them and their future cast and crew good luck. But Benioff and Weiss emerged from their public hibernation to attend a panel at the Austin Film Festival, which I'm guessing they thought they'd be surrounded by friendlies, and finally answer some questions from fans. The two were brutally honest, essentially admitting that they were never fully qualified for the job from the beginning. Now, there's a Twitter user out there who transcribed the entire Q&A. Heroic Twitter user for Arya documented the Q&A session, and much of it reads like satire, written by furious Game of Thrones fans. Benioff and Weiss still aren't sure why George R.R. Martin entrusted them with his magnum opus, as the two didn't have any comparable experience or even an appreciation of the book's themes. Needle and pen replying for Arya. They are describing their pitch and how nervous they were. They pitched to Carolyn Strauss, who has a reputation of being a tough pitch. They were very nervous because of how bad we wanted it. David is describing the pre-meeting with George R.R. Martin, who was questioning their bona fides, and we didn't really have any. We had never done TV, and we didn't have any. We don't know why he trusted us with his life's work, which is different from the story I heard. I heard that George R.R. Martin had asked them about Jon's parentage, and they answered the question correctly, and that's why they got the job. I assumed there was more questions before that, but I'm guessing that was probably the only one. It seems that the two men aimed for a moonshot and somehow hit their target, suddenly tasked with retelling an immensely complex story without fully understanding it. In fact, Benioff once said, "Themes are for 8th grade book reports." This is the guy who ran Game of Thrones, which tells you all you need to know about his dedication to the art of storytelling. Wow! Throwing himself under the bus, and people are driving back over him. If you're wondering why a wildly successful writer is comfortable dismissing themes as childish and unnecessary, it should be noted that Benioff's father is the former head of Goldman Sachs. Do we live in a meritocracy? Well, Bret Stephens still writes for the New York Times. I don't know what the reference is, but yes, there is nepotism in Hollywood. There is cronyism in Hollywood. There's also cocaineism in Hollywood. The two went on to admit that they had absolutely no idea how to work with costume designers. Do you remember the documentary? The costume designer was so nervous when they showed up. It's because she probably never met him. Kind of important for a fantasy series, you think, and described their experience making Thrones as an expensive film school. I wonder how HBO feels about that. And now the prequels not being greenlit to series makes a lot of sense. Needle and pen, they acknowledge that they have no idea why, after such a dismal pilot, why they went forward. Everything we could make a mistake in, we did. Script, cast, costume. They think HBO went forward because they had a lot of foreign pre-sales on the series. Dan is saying that Game of Thrones was basically an expensive film school for he and Dave. For example, they had no idea how to work with costume designers, and it was a huge learning experience. Well, isn't that special? I guess it is hard to fire a kid whose dad works at Goldman Sachs and in some level probably owns HBO and everybody who works on it. On some level, I almost admire their candor. I do as well. This is just like the Bob Iger candor, except these guys aren't running for president. They could have come up with excuses and defended their hideous creative choices. And I love how this writer isn't holding back either. But they realized that there was nowhere left to hide. Fans were almost unanimously united in their disappointment, and little of the anger has evaporated in the months since. And this is what shines a light on Hollywood. I have been saying this for a couple of years. A lot of people in charge of some of our favorite franchises, Doctor Who, Star Trek, Star Wars, don't do the research, don't do the work. The real hardworking people in Hollywood that I experienced in my brief time down there was people who work in post, the art designers, the set designers, the line producers. But the actual people who make choices and creative choices can't be bothered with looking up lore, can't be bothered with sticking to canon. They are way too busy butt-chugging cocaine on a yacht. I'm going to have to revise my statement from earlier. I don't think fans are going to feel better after hearing this. Oddly enough, the show was at its peak during its early seasons when Benioff and Weiss were still learning how to do their jobs. The two initially downplayed the fantasy elements of the book, a decision that helped ground the universe before dragons started flying through the sky, and wanted to expand the audience to non-fantasy fans, normies. This worked in their favor at the beginning of the show and helped expand it into a pop culture juggernaut, but meant that the intricacies of Martin's lore were never explored, and they were never going to be explored. And the normies who got into this wanted to know the lore and went to a Song of Ice and Fire wiki, went and bought the books, went and bought A World of Ice and Fire. George provided plenty of stuff to do outside of the show to give the show context, and they were never going to do it. That's why you didn't get Quaithe. That's why you didn't get Lady Stoneheart. That's why the Warlocks were completely forgotten about. That's why they got rid of the dragons as fast as they could. And that's why they got rid of the Night King as fast as they could, because they were never going to do anything with him. And it does not end there. It gets much worse. And I have a message for the normies in a little bit. The moderator asked why they chose to write all the episodes by themselves, because we didn't know better. David said HBO wanted them to hire other writers, and they decided to have Brian Cogman, their assistant, write 4 episodes, and I never liked the stuff he wrote. Dan wanted to remove as many fantasy elements as possible because we didn't just want to appeal to that type of fan, which was a major mistake. They initially did the right thing, but you had to bring the fantasy. It was a fantasy book. They wanted to expand the fan base to people beyond the fantasy fan base, to mothers, NFL players, and that's where we get to the normies. How does it feel, normies? There's a thing called the fandom menace that a lot of people hadn't heard of, and thanks to Game of Thrones, the fandom menace has grown. I can't tell you how many emails I got from people who didn't realize what was going on with our entertainment, and Game of Thrones is a perfect example. Now you know how Star Wars fans feel, how Star Trek fans feel, how Marvel comic fans feel, how Doctor Who fans feel. This is what happens when hacks take over the thing that you have loved since you were a kid, that you've helped support for decades, that you understand that things change, but when they make drastic changes to the lore, when they destroy previous characters, it tends to piss you off. And when you criticize it, and you're called an istophobe. And if you don't know what that means, it's an ist or a phobe of something. I can't even say those words on YouTube because of the algorithm. And on top of that, you got to deal with other YouTubers telling you you don't understand a book you have read multiple times, constantly over years, when they've only watched the television show. The Faceless Men, the Lord of Light, the Night King, all magical elements of the story that were never resolved despite clearly being vital to the story. Hence, the prince that was promised never showed up, and Beric Dondarrion's grand destiny was teased but never delivered. No, this is where the other YouTubers come in and tell me I didn't understand the themes. Dany winked in episode 3 of season 2, so that means she was going to go crazy at the end of the series. And Beric Dondarrion became the barricade, and that was his sacrifice. That was his prophecy. Benioff and Weiss were elevated to success by HBO's polished infrastructure, the architecture of George R.R. Martin's books, and the immense talent of every individual that surrounded them, particularly the actors. The moderator is asking them about their comments, acknowledging they didn't understand the characters, and the extra minutes helped them understand the characters better. Dan is saying that he let the actors redefine the roles, especially Maisie Williams. Having the actors define the characters really explains a lot. Having the actors define the characters that they played in it Having the actors define the roles that they play in an adaptation is not something I have a problem with, but it does explain Arya's character from season 6 on. She did turn into a Mary Sue. She was unstoppable. She got all the good kills except for that last one where she came out of nowhere and killed the Night King. Turns out that was a meaningless kill. And they began writing for the actors. It's like the actor moved into the house and redecorated. He said he learned about the characters from the actors. They were exposed only when they ran out of material and had to finish the story themselves. Amusingly, the two never went online to read criticisms of the show from fans who clearly understood the books better than they did. Well, Benioff searched online once, but the results upset him, so he never did it again. So he just hit his head in the sand. And now all of the conspiracy theories about them checking out of Game of Thrones, taking that big long break, signing the Star Wars deal, maybe being distracted, really come to light. They probably were all of those things, as well as being scared because they were frauds and they knew it. And I know that's a harsh statement, but that's what they're saying right now. They are very granular in details of shots, admitting losing sight of the big picture. Wow, this is enlightening. It's like no shit, but it's still enlightening. Were you listening to the feedback to your fans as things went along? Really, we did not, says Dan, and Dave said essentially the same thing. It seems that the Game of Thrones writers' room was a safe space, shielded from criticism and outsider perspective. In a way, it's a relief to finally understand why the show went in such a bizarre direction. There was no one there to tell Benioff and Weiss that their ideas were nonsensical, that your ideas were shit. The unintended consequences of candor. I admire Dan and Dave for being honest, and I don't think it was their intention to sound like they just did, but they are Dumb and Dumber, and we got this from Bob Iger as well. So all of your suspicions about what's going on behind the scenes at Disney Star Wars are probably pretty spot on. And as much as the Access media tries to defend them, as much as they tried to defend Game of Thrones, well, it looks like they have more egg on their face right now. Dan and Dave unintentionally confirmed that they were in way over their head. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand the story arcs. They didn't understand the themes nor cared about themes. And they just learned on the job. And they were surrounded by more creative people. Just like those Rise of Skywalker rumors, I had to reshoot 75% of this video due to the Game of Thrones news that has dropped in the last 24 hours. In the middle of shooting the original, it came down that Dan and Dave have left Star Wars. Then this morning, we got the Game of Thrones prequel Blood Moon being canceled, and I did a video on that. It's doing quite well, thank you very much. And then, not long after that, about 4 hours, HBO announced a new prequel, House of Fire and Blood, and it looks like it'll be based on one of the Blackfire Rebellions or the original Dance with Dragons, but are you going to buy it? With this recent news, it looks like Dan and Dave were taking most of the responsibility. We know HBO wanted more seasons of Game of Thrones, but it doesn't really fix anything. It's not going to change that Game of Thrones Season 8 was a total disaster, and your main story fell apart at the end. Does this sound familiar, Disney Star Wars? I hope it does, because you are in for a reckoning that Game of Thrones is going to realize when they try to sell this new prequel. Like I said in my last video, this prequel will be more expensive than the original Game of Thrones series, so it's going to need to be as successful. That means 17.4 million viewers. That's what they had for the premiere episode for Season 8, and I'm guessing it's going to take a while to work up to that. So I guess you're not going to see a few dragons flying through the sky at the bare minimum. It's going to be more than that if they go further in the past with the Targaryens. I guess we'll find out. The question is, do you care, Game of Thrones fans? Dan and Dave, I have to again admire their honesty, even though they didn't intend it. I hope you like what you heard. Please like, share, and subscribe. I will see you in the next video. Unless some Game of Thrones news drops in the next few hours, then I'll do another one. Catch you later.
Nerdrotic.com. Please subscribe.